This is They Create Worlds, episode 222, D&D and Video Games, first edition.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality. You'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, nearby, Alex.
Hello.
Alex is nearby at his parents' place. I am in an office in front of a green screen, and we have a live Twitch chat. Hello.
Hey there, Twitch chat. That's right. It is our big annual live stream where we film/audio record 3 episodes back to back to back while interacting with our adoring fans, thus making Jeffrey's usually editing hell a very special kind of hell, like the one reserved for child molesters and people who talk at the theater. Bonus points, of course, if you get that reference.
I still need to come up with a way for them to turn in those bonus points.
Indeed. So yeah, this will still, as people who've listened to our past live recorded episodes know, this will be largely a typical episode because we are recording normal episodes this way, but there might be a few interjections here and there where we are responding to comments in our Twitch chat, which of course you would not normally get in an episode, but otherwise these are perfectly ordinary episodes that just happen to be filmed. I believe for crazy people that want to see the video of that, that will also be posted, right, Mr. Jeffrey?
Yes, we will be posting that to our YouTube channel, the same place where you can get all of our fine, loving episodes. We'll also be on there in a nice little playlist called Livestream, because, you know, really inventive like that.
Yes, aren't we, though? Though our live stream does get more professional every year. Anywho, so, yeah, I guess we should probably get around to telling the good people what the topic of this episode and our following 2, I say again, following 2 + 1, 3 episodes are going to be about, which, as our live stream audience already knows because it's in nice, comforting blue letters at the top of the screen, is Dungeons and Dragons and Video Games.
Which is just like our DragonCon presentation, but instead of being 50 minutes, it's going to be, 6 hours worth of it?
Yeah, give or take. Give or take. We'll see how it goes. For those that are patrons of our Patreon, you may have already seen a very, very truncated version of what we are about to do, because we did do a presentation on this at DragonCon this year. That was, of course, deliberate to synergize the researching there a bit, but DragonCon gives us 50 minutes. That is not enough for They Create Worlds. We're going to be doing a far more in-depth look at that. We're not going to get too nitty-gritty on any particular game or system. I'm sure we'll go into a little depth here and there, but not too nitty-gritty. This is more of an overview. We want to talk about the creation of Dungeons and Dragons, the various influences that led to the creation of that game, and then how that game very quickly migrated unofficially into the computer game space. It's kind of charting a wider evolution. Don't know how far into the future we will go on this. Part of that will depend on the time, I'm sure. We'll at least cover developments up until the early to mid-1980s. It's possible we'll touch on something after that, but not too likely, I don't think, because it will be 3 episodes. We've been successful. I just want to say for the record, Jeff, we have been successful at that with our live streams. Our live streams are always targeted at 3 episodes, and we have always delivered at 3 episodes. Now I've just, jinxed it and all of that, but that's okay.
So, if we were to go back in time and redo that DragonCon presentation, minus the slides, how would we start it once more as we go back into the ancient times, before video games, before tabletop role-playing games, back when they just took these wonderful things called miniatures and decided that, rolling dice in order to blow up this other guy's miniature sounds fun.
Something like that. Well, it really wasn't done for fun in the beginning. It was really done to figure out how to blow up people in real life, Back in the old Kriegsspiel days, if you died in the game, you died for real, or at least hypothetically speaking. But no, so there are a lot of places that you can start a story like this. Certainly, John Peterson, whose work is invaluable to what we were doing here today, his trilogy, Playing at the World, The Elusive Shift, and Game Wizards make a lot of what we're doing possible. But John Peterson certainly starts this story in many different places, because he starts it in one place, and then he'll go back and start it another place, and then he'll go back and start it yet another place again. Yeah, there are a lot of places that you can start this history of D&D, but I really want to start with how the communities of players started to form, because the creation of D&D, which we should of course mention, was published 50 years ago this year, which is why we're doing all of this in the first place. January of 1974 is when it started. It's really created out of the confluence of two distinct groups of wargamers who live in different parts of the Midwest, which is where all of the wargaming goes place. Is that because the West Coast and the East Coast are just such war zones, you know, with all those big scary cities and all those scary pimps and gigolos and other things all of the movies tell me about, that it's already such a war zone on the coast that they would never want to, do this, and that's why Midwesterners who live in their dull, boring little farm towns do this? Is that what's going on? Now that I've insulted every part of the country equally in different ways, what does Twitch chat think about all that?
There are things in the Midwest where there were some wars or something, I've been told. Apparently someone resembles that remark.
Yes, indeed. But yeah, it's really about the confluence of these two different groups. And so we kind of have to start this by discussing how you even got groups of players of these games back in the early days. Because the hobby, and again, there are different other earlier places where you can play certain aspects of it, but we're not interested in documenting every part of it in detail. But the hobby of wargaming really got started in the United States in the middle to late 1950s. It was really through board wargaming that the hobby really took off. Now, we're going to get to miniatures wargaming, and obviously miniatures wargaming far predates the 1950s, but if board wargaming was niche, then miniatures wargaming was just downright esoteric. We'll cover all of that, but this really all goes back to wargaming fandom, which was primarily in the beginning board wargaming fandom, that started up in the 1950s. And of course, it really all grew up around the works of a company called Avalon Hill. This story, I think, is pretty well known. We don't need to dwell on it since Avalon Hill isn't going to be a huge part of our story. But basically, there was a guy named Charles Roberts who had experience as an ad man, who was a reservist, and he really, really wanted to be a soldier. Really, really badly wanted to be in the military. As an actual active duty, full-time personnel, not an ever-ready or a no-good, as they at times have called the enlisted reserve in the National Guard when they're on active duty. The Korean War seemed to offer an opportunity for that because, of course, there was a massive drawdown of the armed forces after World War II. Then suddenly we were in the Cold War, and the Cold War was turning hot in certain parts of the world, and we ended up in a conflict in Korea that we were not expecting and not necessarily wanting. Diplomacy, Oliva, yes. Diplomacy plays a role in the story as well, for sure. So you may not have played D&D, but you played proto-D&D. We've never been diplomacy players, but Jeffrey's horrible flashbacks of a similar nature would come when our group of friends would play the Fantasy Flight Games Game of Thrones board game, which has some very diplomacy-like elements in it. And Jeffrey just wanted to move his pretty pieces around the pretty board and play his pretty leader cards from his hand. Meanwhile, all the rest of us would want to go off and have 2-hour-long round-robin conversations where everyone is trying to make deals with everyone else. And poor Jeffrey was like, can we just play the game? So, it's a game that never lasts longer than 10 turns. It can be shorter, but the maximum is 10 turns, which sounds like it wouldn't take too long until you add 45 minutes of negotiations between each turn. Right, Jeffrey?
Then a game that is supposed to be an hour or two turns into 8.
Yeah. That's how we rolled. It was all pointless because James was just going to win anyway. So why did we even bother with all of that politicking when James was just going to win anyway?
I don't know.
Indeed. So they had a program going, the government did, the military did, during the Korean War, where it was possible for a reservist to receive a commission as an actual real soldier. So Roberts was pursuing this, and he wanted to brush up on his own tactical knowledge and abilities. So he created a little board game for himself called Tactics in order to do that. The whole military thing didn't pan out. The Korean War came to an end. They ended the program. Roberts never got to be part of the military. But he did have this board game that he had created. He was like, well, this is kind of cool. Maybe I should try publishing it. So he founded a little thing called originally the Avalon Game Company, later changed to Avalon Hill, and published Tactics. He sold a few, enough to kind of keep this business that he was just running out of his house going. But then in 1958, he published a revised version, Tactics 2, and he also published his first Civil War game. That kind of led into the early 1960s, which of course was the centennial of the Civil War. So that got a little more notice for his Gettysburg game and his Chancellorsville game, and suddenly attracted a following. I mean, this is still a niche hobby, but he actually had like a real business at this point. He was actually selling thousands, maybe even tens of thousands of units of these games. So he slowly grew his business over the next little bit until he ended up hitting a problem with a recession in the early 1960s and the decline of a lot of the retailers and distributors that he was using to sell his games as a result, that forced him to sell out to some of his creditors, including the Dot family, who were his printers. We won't get into all of those Avalon Hill corporate shenanigans because they really don't matter. And we are keeping this to 3. That's right, 3 episodes. We won't get too much into that, but the one final thing, one of the last things that Roberts did before he sold out to the Dot family, was he founded a periodical, a magazine called The General, founded it in 1964. The General is a big part of where this fandom starts to coalesce, because these games, like I said, they were played by very isolated groups of people around the country. It could be a real challenge finding players, finding other people that were interested in the same thing, because these were and are, because these types of games still exist, very, very fiddly games with lots and lots of little cardboard pieces and all sorts of complicated rules that would take hours to set up and hours to play. If you didn't really love military history, you probably weren't going to bother with all of that. It was niche. People were really spread out. So Roberts and his people had the really smart idea that they started in about the 3rd issue of The General, which was the Opponents Wanted section. This was basically a classified ad section for people looking to connect, to play war games. Unlike the singles ads in your local newspaper, they made this completely free. I mean, I guess you paid the postage, but if you sent in an Opponents Wanted request, they would print exactly what you sent them, word for word, completely free of charge. So they had this completely free Opponents Wanted section that allowed people from all over the country to be like, German player looking for Allied player in Africa Corps, right to blah, blah, blah. Because, of course, since these were board games, you could play them by mail. I mean, people did hope that they might find people in their local community that they could play with this way, but they were also very happy to do play-by-mail games, which is exactly as long and tedious as it sounds, which is that each of you set up this board full of many, many fiddly little cardboard bits across all of these different hexes. Then trust each other as you relay your moves that everyone is always moving every single one of these little tiny pieces into the exact right spot. Nobody's cheating, we promise. And yeah, that sounds like a lot.
It does. I can only imagine the horrors of just trying to keep track of that and just make an honest mistake, let alone an intentional one.
Indeed. But people were willing to get what they could get because it was really hard to get people to play these games with them. So a community grew up within The General, and it's kind of interesting the way these communities developed, because just like in modern internet forums and Discord channels and other social media places, the trolls always got the most attention. You know, these ads started out with just Axis player of Africa Corps looking for Allied player. Or, Northern General looking for Southern General to play a game of Gettysburg. lots of people are sending these in. So you want your ads to stand out. So then it starts to become like, the Reich is rolling through all opposition, and for the glory of the Vaterland, we have invaded North Africa to drive out the imperialist British scum. Who can dare oppose us? What British general would dare to oppose the might of General Rommel? Write to me and we can play a game of Africa Corps. So I mean, things would start to get very, very intense like this, because this is what would get you noticed. This would get your attention. And so a lot of these ads did start to get kind of like, there were a lot of Nazi and Confederate language starting to appear in these opponents wanted. And Peterson examines this question a little bit. Obviously, we don't have complete data to be able to say anything definitively, but Peterson is of the opinion that most of them were not actually white supremacist, Confederate sympathizers, Nazi sympathizers. There probably were a few mixed in, because people that are romanticizing the glory of the Reich or the glory of the so-called lost cause are going to be drawn to these things in all of their forms, including war games where they can rewrite history. But the sense is that most of these people were actually just trying to shock their peers in order to get noticed in the pages of Opponents Wanted. A lot of these were, teenagers and college students in boring Midwest hamlets that never met a Nazi and never wanted to meet a Nazi. But were actually quite nice when you got to know them. They.
Think of it in the context of even modern times. You have people, or kids really, who don't know better, or adults who just don't have much of a filter, and they say weird, derogatory things online, write stuff like that. I mean, we've all encountered this online. The internet can be a very toxic place, but that doesn't mean that the internet coming about made that happen. It's always been there. There have been that kind of thing in stuff before then, and there will be stuff after that. The way this all comes about is because people take on that role. They might take it too seriously. They may or may not believe in it. And like you said, Alex, they're trying to get people to play a game with them. Am I going to play a game and show that person what's what if they're just like, hi, I play the Axis side and I'm willing to play with anyone who wishes to play somewhere in Africa? Or are they going to do that for someone who says something really challenging and derogatory to go, I need to show that person what's what and beat them in this game?
Indeed. So these kind of things, there was a small amount of role-playing going on right there in the pages of Opponents Wanted. Now, I don't want to blow that out of proportion, because this was just kind of an advertising gimmick. There were probably a small number of imaginative individuals that actually saw themselves as Rommel or Grant or Lee when they were overlooking their board of fiddly cardboard pieces. But for the most part, this was just performance art within the pages of Opponents Wanted. It's not like when they were actually playing their play-by-mail games, they were typing up these elaborate dispatches that looked like they were coming from the front lines when they were telling their friend how the pieces moved. It wasn't a lot of role-playing, but it's interesting how there was just a little bit of role-playing going on. But they were doing this performative thing, and it started kind of taking on a life of its own, because the next logical thing to do once you were finding an opponent here or opponent there to play these war games, it was to try to organize in a more comprehensive manner, because once you start discovering these people, again, it's a niche hobby, so you want to keep doing these games with the same group of people. So these wargaming organizations started to form, and originally they were largely forming around these kind of performative activities within the Opponents Wanted. You have this one guy that's raving about the invincibility of the 1,000-Year Reich, so please play me in Africa Corps. That kind of morphs into, well, we've got this whole group of people that are rolling over everybody, and who can stand against us? They did not tend to call themselves Nazis, thankfully, at this point, but one of the big groups that was doing this was a group called Spectre, because this was the 1960s, and James Bond was a thing. Spectre started to organize itself around individual representatives in different states, different communities, and they would start saying things like, Spectre has just conquered Virginia and is moving west. Can anyone stop the onslaught of Spectre? Please play us in a game of Chancellorsville. You know, it's just like this idea that you have these villainous organizations that are overrunning parts of the United States, and you need bold heroes to stand up and stop them. And again, this is just another kind of way to recruit people to play games. And so then you had other organizations that were forming in opposition to groups like Spectre and similar groups that were talking about how they were conquering everything. So you had these individual kind of wargaming clubs organizing across these wide swaths of territory, somewhat following the template that had already been established by the already existent sci-fi fandoms that by the 1960s had already been publishing newsletters and holding conventions and doing all of this kind of stuff for years and years. Once these groups started to organize in this way, these kind of slightly silly, more performative aspects start to melt away, and you get kind of another generation, probably slightly older players, some of whom may have started as high school players and themselves have grown up a little bit now, kind of dumping this performative aspect and kind of dropped the performative aspect of what they were doing and just organized as regional or even national networks of wargame players. They maintained membership lists, collected dues, and also wrote their own newsletters, which, with cheaper and cheaper mimeographs and stuff appearing in the 1960s, became a more and more viable thing to do. So you had groups of wargamers that were just in mutual interest clubs, and these newsletters would kind of parrot what the general was doing, which was reporting on new games coming out, providing historical tidbits, providing tips on how to play games, helping locate opponents, providing after-action reports of games, but doing it on a lower, more indie level because the hobby was very small. Avalon Hill were really the only ones involved. SPI would come along in a few years, but are not quite there yet. So there was a certain level of gatekeeping that was done by Avalon Hill. They encouraged a little bit of independent activity. They did start releasing sheets of counters and hex boards and whatnot that people could use to design their own games, but they didn't want to go too far down that road because the hobby was so small that if an indie scene got too professional, there really may not have been room for both Avalon Hill and its competitors. It's not like the modern video game industry where you can have an indie scene and you can have a professional scene and you can have a modder scene. They can all kind of coexist. Doesn't mean that the big companies are always happy that they have that competition, but at the end of the day, there is a big enough market that can all coexist, even if it does so uneasily. That is not the case in the wargaming hobby of the 1960s. Avalon Hill did a lot of gatekeeping within the hobby other than this opponents wanted thing, which just opened the floodgates to everybody. So these regional clubs started making their own newsletters parroting the General or Strategy and Tactics, a big miniatures magazine at the time, and allowing for this more indie collaborative spirit to happen. That's kind of where our story really begins. And now we have to talk about a couple of these organizations. And I think I'm probably going to talk about them in the opposite order of how we did in our live event, just to provide a little balance so we discuss each side equally. Because, of course, there's really two sets of these gamers that we need to talk about. That is the Twin Cities Military Miniatures Group up in Minnesota, and the International Federation of Wargamers, a technically international because they had like one British guy that was in it or something, but mostly national group that also encompassed several subgroups like the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. In the interest of expediency for the live talk, we focused more on the Gygax side of things than the Arneson side of things, not as a judgment. We're not wading into that. But just because we were kind of charting the spread, and TSR is more important to the spread, here today, I think we'll talk a little bit first about the good people up in Minneapolis, St. Paul. The Twin Cities Military Miniatures Group, as the name implies, was a group that was dedicated not so much to the board wargaming that we've been talking about this entire time, but is actually more wedded to the whole miniatures thing that we briefly mentioned at the start, but didn't really get into in any kind of depth. Miniatures wargaming is a very, very different beast than board wargaming. For one thing, there's some assembly required. By some assembly, I mean you have to buy all of those little soldiers, put them together yourself, and paint them yourself. And at this point, shout out to my dad, actually, because he is big into all of that kind of thing himself.
That it is. Alex and him do a yearly big fight battle thing that can take, I don't know, what is it, a week it takes you guys?
Yeah, we haven't done one recently, but yeah, we used to do World War II scenarios together. I'm not sure which system he's been using most recently. He does 20 millimeter, and the hobby in general has kind of rallied more around 15 millimeter, particularly Flames of War, but that's not his scale. Yeah, so there's some assembly required in this little hobby. You have to buy a lot of figures, you have to paint a lot of figures to get that whole collection together. You need a space that you can play in that is usually a little more elaborate than the dining room table. Now, you can, in a pinch, use the dining room table if you cover it with all sorts of stuff, but in general, you're going to need a basement or you're going to need some kind of community facility that would let you set it up. And the other thing, of course, is that there is no playing by mail with military miniatures. That is not going to happen. It's hard enough for you to get your whole army together. You're not also going to get an exact copy of your buddy's whole army together and have identical tables and hold your rulers in the exact same way, because it is all ruler and tape measure movement in order to get armies to the right spot. So it's a very different kind of fandom, and it is much more niche. Avalon Hill does not touch miniatures wargaming. There is too little. It is too spread out. So the DIY mentality within military miniatures is even greater than the DIY mentality in board wargaming. There are very few rule sets that support this. And in fact, it's interesting, one of the most common rule sets was actually created by science fiction author H.G. Wells right before World War I, Little Wars. I say this is interesting because military miniatures from the beginning has always had a little aspect of storytelling involved in it. Sorry about that. Yeah, do it yourself. That was the DIY I was referring to. Sorry for getting a little jargony there. So I find that interesting because there's always been a little bit of role-playing and narrative in military miniatures gaming, which I find fascinating because two of the earliest proponents of using miniatures for staging games were H.G. Wells and Robert Louis Stevenson, two authors. Because, of course, military miniatures go way back, but most people just wanted them for display purposes. They were not there to be used in wargaming. It's just some crazy people started to use them in that way, and it just kind of spiraled out of control from there. In fact, the Twin Cities Military Miniatures Group was itself not primarily a wargaming group. It was founded in 1963 by a gentleman named Ray Allard, who had no interest at all in miniatures wargaming. He and a bunch of his friends, and these were older people. Most of the founders of this group were older people, some of them World War II and Korea veterans. They were there only for the painting and the display of miniatures. They really didn't care at all about this thing, but there were two younger members of the group that joined either right at or very, very, very soon after the founding. One of them was Ray Allard's son, Ray Allard Jr., and the other was an individual by the name of David Wesley. They were actually drawn to this group by the idea of actually doing miniatures wargaming, which, as I said, is something that existed. There had been a small spark of interest in it in the United States, starting in 1957, when an individual named Jack Scrubby started to publish a magazine, Strategy and Tactics, and also started casting some relatively cheap, in the grand scheme of things, miniatures. There were a small number of people. Yeah, Scrooby, that's true. Jack Scrooby, S-C-R-U-B-Y is how that's spelled. Yeah, so he was, I do believe Wesley, just to answer what you're saying there, Ethan, Wesley has said that he was at the first meeting, which I see no reason to doubt. I mean, are the people that attended the first meeting what you would call founding members, or just like Allard decided to do this group and put out a call and they showed up? I mean, calling him a founding member probably makes it sound more formal and official than it really was, but he seemed to have been coming to the meetings from the beginning, at the very least. The fact that he was so much younger than any of the others that were there, as he put it himself in one description, Allard himself was 54. He was the oldest. Then most of the rest of the members there were in their 30s. And then Wesley and Ray Allard Jr., not to be confused with the founder, were teenagers. I doubt the rest of the group necessarily treated them as quote-unquote founding members, but they hung out, and some of the older guys even occasionally deigned to come by and play battles with them. In general, kind of these two groups were very separate from each other, though, even though it just started with the two of them, as time went on, other young people also found their way to the group. It wasn't long that Wesley and Allard Jr. were the only ones interested in the wargaming. There had been kind of a small movement towards this through Jack Scrooby and strategy and tactics and all of this, but it was still pretty niche and there were not a lot of rules out there. So Wesley, it was a pretty smart guy, still is, he's still alive, really wanted to kind of dig deeper into this than some of the current rules that were available and started basically reading everything that he could find anywhere about wargaming, which eventually led him down the path of discovering the German, the Prussian Kriegsspiel, which, as opposed to being a game, a pastime where two people or more are just having fun with each other, were actual military wargaming exercises that were meant to not just instruct in the waging of war, but also to simulate specific plans to see how viable those plans were. We're not going to go into a complete history of Kriegsspiel here, because we are actually going to edit ourselves some. 3 episodes and all of that. 3. A 1, a 2, a 3. How many episodes does it take to get the center of Dungeons & Dragons? 3. 3 is the number, and that number shall be 3. Yes, as Derek IRL points out in chat, I do have a chapter on Kriegsspiel in my book. Of course, a lot of that is adapted from Peterson's work in Playing at the World. The original version that goes into all those Kriegsspiel details is currently out of print, but when Volume 2 comes out early next year of his revised version, a lot of that Kriegsspiel stuff will show up again there as well. So we won't go into all of Kriegsspiel today. These Kriegsspiel and derivatives thereof, because of course then this came to America and some Americans made their own modifications, which we'll talk about in a bit, but these Kriegsspiel played out a little differently from your traditional miniatures combat between friends, this kind of casual military miniatures wargaming based on Little Wars and the few other systems that existed at the time, because they were attempting to model all of the conditions of war as accurately as they could within a simulation, which included not having a clue about where your enemy is. Obviously, if the two of you are staring across each other across a basement table or a ping pong table or whatever else, you're both there. Everyone's armies are there for both people to see. So these games had something in particular that you did not find generally at this time in miniatures wargaming amongst casual friends, which is this idea of a referee. Somebody who is a neutral arbiter of the game, who is existing outside of the game but has complete knowledge of what is happening and can communicate the situation to the players as they move around the field of battle and make contact with the enemy. Wesley really starts getting into this kind of thing in his wargaming and his circle of wargaming friends, which does expand. It starts with just Allard Jr. and himself, but other people join this group and starts really focusing in on how can we make these encounters as realistic as possible. their wargaming starts incorporating fog of war. It starts incorporating incomplete information and the methods through which you would acquire more complete information about what's happening around you. Obviously, as you move your soldiers around, your scouts are eventually going to discover the scouts or the main force of the other enemy, and you'll kind of discover where they are there. But there's also the possibility that the locals may have seen troop movements. You may come across a farm, and the farmers there have seen armies moving, and you interrogate them, and they tell you where it is. So there's not role-playing going on yet at this point. You still have primarily, two opposing generals that are moving their armies around, but Dave Wesley starts playing around with this idea of what if there's a referee that has additional information? And what if the players have to interact with other elements on the board to gather that information? And there's no characterization going. It's not like David Wesley is playing the farmer. It's not an NPC. But we're starting to get into a situation of, well, what if they do talk to a farmer and they get some information that way? How are they going to make contact with the enemy? So Wesley starts developing this idea of the referee as an important component of his games. Now, at some point when all of this is going on, and a lot of the early stuff, the timeline's very vague, but at some point when this is going on about 1965, I believe it is, a board wargamer by the name of Dave Arneson, he's still a teenager, he's an older teenager, puts an ad in the opponent's wanted section of the General. This is why we have to, even though board wargaming isn't the main vector through which RPGs are created, this is why we have to do all of that Avalon Hill setup. Because even though the board wargames don't directly influence D&D so much, outside of diplomacy, which is a big influence, it's these connections that Avalon Hill and board wargaming fosters that are very important to the development of these groups. So in about 1965, this teenager, David Arneson, posts in the General looking for an opponent to play Avalon Hill board wargames with. He had become enthused with them after his parents had bought him the Chancellorsville game, and he just kind of fell in love with this board wargaming. The people at the Twin Cities Military Miniatures group are also, they play some of those games too, and they get the General. So Wesley sees that ad. So Wesley and some of his friends go over to Arneson's house, and the Secrets of Blackmore kind of discusses this first meeting, a documentary that gets more of the story from the Arneson group and de-emphasizes the Gygax group. They kind of just show up at the door, and they're like, we're here to see David Arneson, and I think it was his mother that answered, it's like the boys are in the basement, where all the losers go, in their parents' basement. I have my own place. I'm just here to help, I promise. I am not just an adult, but a fully realized person with my own friends and credit cards and keys.
You do have keys, I know that.
I have credit cards, too. I won't show it to you.
How will we know that they're real?
It's like, yeah, you've shown us the front, but anyone can fake the front. Can you show us the back, too, Alex, so we can make sure it's an authentic credit card? It's like, what an odd request, but sure, I'll do that on a live stream. Why not?
That'll be safe.
You want the last 4 of my social while we're at it?
No, I'll just take the first 6 or so.
Fun fact, and I obviously will not say what the numbers are, but fun fact, my mom and I have the exact same last 4.
Really?
What are the odds of that?
I don't know.
Because the first 6 are all classifications. They're based on the region and the office that issued. Like, they have specific meaning. And then you get the last 4. Yeah, my mom and I have the same last 4.
Crazy de facto universal ID number.
Indeed. Anywho, but no, I'm not telling you what those numbers are. That's only for our patrons. At the $2 million level, I will reveal all of my personal information so you can attempt to steal my identity. That's at the $2 million Patreon level.
Do we even have that?
We don't have levels at all, actually. So, they can give whatever they want.
Okay, so if you do 2 million and join our Patreon, don't do it through the iOS app, because 30% on 2 million is going to be a lot. Just do it through the website.
Yeah, please don't. Remember, we're on a by-episode payment system, so the 2 million level is actually 4 million because it's 2 million per episode.
You do that, we'll just retire and just do the podcast all the time.
Indeed. Esmoliva in the chat, who, of course, had a wonderful, wonderful blog going that summarized the episodes of Computer Chronicles, and not just summarized, but also added additional historical details from Esmoliva's own fantastic research, has also done some supporting podcasts, doing deep dives on topics. I definitely encourage everyone to check out Computer Chronicles Revisited, which is that blog. Esmoliva points out something very interesting on this topic in the chat. There was a 1986 Computer Chronicles episode on bulletin board systems. The most amusing thing was they spent like 5 minutes discussing the problem of people stealing and posting credit card numbers online. All the way back in 1986 on BBSs. Delightful.
And it's still a problem today.
Indeed. Just ask the good people at archive.org. Not that any credit card numbers were stolen in that. Topical conversation. We do that sometimes. No one will know what I'm talking about, even if they listen to this episode 2 months from now. But the people in chat right now, they know. They know. I think I was talking about war games.
Yes, war games and the inception of having a GM and having someone actually administer the thing so that we could have interaction with NPCs in order to lead to, I don't know, adventures.
Yeah, we talked about all that, but I was talking about Arneson. So they met Arneson, and Arneson became part of the group. And because there were kind of this divide within the group between the paint, mock-up, and display miniatures people and the let's wargame with miniatures people, Arneson's home kind of gradually became the new home on that ping pong table of the people that were interested in the military miniatures wargaming. That's not something that Arneson had really been exposed to, I don't think, before he met Wesley and crew, but he was instantly hooked on that stuff once they introduced it to him. We've got this circle that includes Arneson, and we've got Wesley that's really pushing the limits of what a military miniatures campaign could be in the name primarily of more realistic encounters. And he's drawing in elements of Kriegsspiel, especially the referee, in order to make this happen. Then at some point, and again, the dates are really vague here, Wesley tends to put the dates earlier in time. Peterson tends to put them a little bit later, and we're just talking about a matter of a couple of years. We're not talking decades here. Peterson's dating is probably more reliable because Wesley is just going off of memory, and they were, 40-plus-year-old memories at the time. Whereas Peterson has a small amount of documents in the form of fanzines that he can use to date some events. Somewhere between 1967 and 1969. Probably closer to 69 than 67. Wesley discovers a particular Kriegsspiel book in the library of the University of Minnesota, because basically he wants all the information he can possibly get on wargaming to improve his own wargaming. So he's scouring all the libraries nearby in their game sections, military history sections, whatever, to find books. He stumbles across a book by a guy named Charles Totten called Strategos. Again, not to get too bogged down in the history of Kriegsspiel. That's a tangent that we're actually not going to go. Ethan's saying Wesley actually says he found Strategos in 1964 now. And yeah, that's true. And it's possible he found it a little earlier because they also talk in Secrets of Blackmore about how they used the book as a recruitment tool. Because this is back in the day when library stuff was all on paper and the idea of redacting PII, personal identifying information, did not exist. You could look on the card in the back of the book and see who checked out a book before you. It was just there. They do claim that they actually used Strategos to recruit more members because they figured anyone that checked out that book was probably interested in wargaming just like they were, and so they would track down people who checked out the book to swell the ranks of the Twin City Military Miniatures Group. It might have been a little earlier. 64 seems awfully early, and I know, Ethan, you're just reporting what Wesley has said, and as you said earlier in the chat, they definitely seem to have a tendency, kind of the same as Nolan Bushnell in a way, they have a tendency to try to date stuff as early as they possibly can because it feels more pioneering and whatnot that way. 64 seems a little early. 67 is probably reasonable for when he first discovered it, 66, 67. And then, of course, it took a few years after that for him to create his own game based on some of the concepts in there, which is obviously something that we're going to address here in a moment. So again, we don't want to get too bogged down in the history of Kriegsspiel, but one thing that set apart the military of the United States from the military of, say, Prussia, which then, of course, becomes the German Empire, is that Prussia/Germany was a military state, truly a military state, where the military dominated all walks of society. And of course, it was the acumen of the military that allowed for the unification of Germany by blood and by iron, as Bismarck famously said. They had a very large professional military with a large general staff and lots of infrastructure, and so their war games were really based on harnessing that incredible military machine. The United States had a very, very, very small military, especially when you consider the size of the United States, which is rather big. Most of that military was spread out amongst a series of relatively isolated forts across the western frontier, doing their best to, quote-unquote, settle the American West, which mostly meant relocating the people that were already quite settled there, thank you very much. He saw that American military professionals needed a different kind of war game, because the caliber of the officer was not necessarily quite as great, and the need was more for small-scale military engagements. Like, there was a need for captains and majors to be able to lead small detachments rather than the need for a general staff to be directing army commanders in massive campaigns across the entirety of Europe. He kind of broke his game, Strategos, down into something that was a little more manageable and a little more personal in that way. One element that he brought into it that was somewhat different, according to Peterson's research, obviously I haven't researched all the varieties of Kriegsspiel in great depth myself, but one of the things that Peterson and Wesley himself also found back in the day that was very different about Strategos than other war games is it had a referee, because there's always a referee in these kind of professional military situations. Not only did the game have a referee, but it specifically said that the players can attempt anything they can think of, and the referee will determine whether that thing is successful. Totten, in his own book, really kind of downplays that, because he goes on to say, yes, they can attempt anything, but most things are going to be unadvisable. I don't think Totten was in any way trying to create a new concept of the referee's role in a war game. He was just saying, yeah, there's a referee, so basically tell the referee anything that you want to try. And, the subtext is kind of, most of the time, the referee is going to tell you that's dumb, we're not going to do that. So he's just kind of reinforcing the idea that you can ask. He's not saying that the referee is then going to take every single one of your requests seriously, which is a completely different thing. Yes, Crater says, I seduced the opposing general. Totten would most certainly say, yes, you can ask the referee that, but he's not going to allow that. He's just going to say, go back and come back when you have something real for me.
You're not a bard.
He becomes fascinated with this idea of expanding the range of options that the players have within a military miniatures game beyond the purely military and the moving of armies and the expending of ordnance. He kind of tries to use the Strategos rules. He tries to start incorporating them into their games, but they are a bit too complicated for what they're doing, because we do need to recall that Totten was writing for military professionals. He was not writing for a bunch of high school and college students that wanted to play at war in their basement. There were elements of it that didn't necessarily fully work for what they were doing, but he was trying to incorporate a little more of that attempt anything kind of ethos into the games he was running. Now we need to step back from Wesley a little bit and talk a little bit about what Arneson is doing at the same time, because Arneson is very much emerging as a leader of this group as well. By the late 60s, Arneson is a college student. He's studying history at the University of Minnesota, so he's still local. He is starting to have really grand ambitions about the kind of games that they can play. He's been introduced to Strategos and all this other stuff, as Wesley has, of course, because he's part of the same group. He's also been introduced to Diplomacy, which is a war game still, where ostensibly the point of the game is it's set in kind of the Great Powers period on the eve of World War I in Europe, You've still got armies on the board, and the idea is still at the end of the day that you are moving your armies around and conquering on the board. But the twist in diplomacy is that you are actually each taking on the role of the ruler of a nation. You're not just a nameless, faceless general on the battlefield or this godlike figure that's puppet master that's controlling all the generals. Like, you are actually embodying the ruler of the nation. Diplomacy games, partially by design and partially because of the temperament of players, involve a lot of deal-making and alliance-making and backstabbing, all of the stuff that Jeffrey absolutely hated about playing the Game of Thrones board game with our group of friends.
So many backroom deals.
So Arneson was really into all of these kind of games. He was into traditional Avalon Hill style board wargaming. He was into diplomacy. He was into this miniatures wargaming that he was introduced to by Wesley and friends. He was intrigued by some of the stuff that was going on with expanding the role of the referee and expanding Fog of War and all of this stuff that was going on in those games. Arneson decides that he's going to combine all of these things into one gigantic game. A grand Napoleonic campaign. Because the Napoleonic War was his jam. That's where they did the vast majority of their work with military miniatures wargaming. Diplomacy is set in the late 19th century, but another enthusiast had created a diplomacy variant that took place during the Napoleonic era instead of the late 19th century Great Powers era. So they're going to have a diplomacy style game at the top of this grand Napoleonic simulation, in which every single participant takes on a specific and defined role in a government. Many of them are playing heads of state, but some of them are also playing other figures within administrations as well. Then, when these armies are maneuvering around and they come into contact with each other, there will be military miniatures battles, actions, that take place to determine the outcome of individual battles. So he gets this crazy simulation campaign going. So he needed players for this campaign. He needed lots of players for this campaign. He was participating in some of these fandoms during this time and had a need to find players for this campaign. And so he's starting to put out the call about this campaign in the newsletters. He also decides, as a way to try to find more players, to go to a relatively new wargaming convention that has just started up in the resort town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, called appropriately enough the Lake Geneva Wargaming Convention, which would quickly be shortened to Gen Con. I don't think it lasted very long. It's some obscure little thing that just kind of vanished.
They might be doing something still in Indianapolis, Indiana, or something like that. Not sure, though.
So now we need to pause on our Arneson Wesley track here and back up a couple of years, do that Hamilton rewind there, and talk about this other group that is developed over time that was started in 1966 as the United States Continental Army Command, but quickly changed its name to the International Federation of Wargamers. So this takes us back to our earlier Avalon Hill conversation that we were having once again. As I said, back on the kind of Avalon Hill in general side, you had these organizations that were beginning to form. They formed out of the opponent's wanted pages. They had started out oftentimes being these kind of melodramatic, overly dramatic Nazi and Confederate sympathizers and James Bond villainous organizations trying to find opponents. And then it had started to calm down a little bit and become, a little more adult and a little more just, hey, we all like war games. Maybe we should band together. And do you like World War II, Homer?
Yes, Mr. President.
Do you like board games?
Yes, Mr. President.
Then why don't you come over to my place and we'll play some World War II board games?
Yay!
One of these organizations was this Continental Army Command that was founded in 1966 by a guy named William Spear. It had a bit of a rough start and was basically essentially reformed in 1967 with some additional members, Spear kind of stepping back a little and some additional members taking over to create the International Federation of Wargamers, which, as I said, they had like one British person or something like that on their mailing list at the very beginning, so it did technically meet the definition of an international federation, though it was obviously not particularly international. One of the people that was very involved in this group at this point was Gary Gygax, who was one of these really fanatical board war gamers and also was kind of a frustrated author, so to speak. I mean, he hadn't tried to make it as an author. He was a high school dropout. He was working as an insurance underwriter. He was a Jehovah's Witness with big family trying to make ends meet in Lake Geneva, but he had been an avid fan of early fantasy fiction, stuff by Fritz Lieber, and Robert E. Howard, the Conan books, Jack Vance, not so much Tolkien, but a lot of these others. So, he kind of had this literary bent to him, even though he hadn't been able to use it very much. As an avid player of these games, he also really, really liked writing about them and really wanted to collaborate with people in writing about them. He was drawn to the pages of the General and Strategy and Tactics and every fanzine that he could get his hands on. Part of the reason why Peterson has such a complete view of what Gygax was thinking and doing in the 1960s and the early 1970s is that he tracked down every last one of these obscure little fandom papers, and Gygax's thoughts are just spilled off across all of them. So he starts taking a more active role in the IFW, or the IFW, as Ethan Johnson, friend of the show, would have us pronounce it, though we won't. Was writing articles for the Spartan, which was their specific organ of the International Federation of Wargamers, in addition to being in the General and Strategy and Tactics and up in everyone else's business as well. So the organization decided in 1967 to have a gathering. This is how these things kind of develop. It's how they developed in science fiction fandom 25, 30 years before this. First, you start corresponding with a group of people with similar interests. Then you get a newsletter together with your friends of similar interests. Then you all want to meet each other in person. Suddenly you have Worldcon. This is kind of a similar idea here. You have all of these people with a similar interest, and they've joined this group. They found each other through the General and the Opponents Wanted. Then they start their own fanzine, the Spartan. Now it's like, well, let's get together. So they decided to have a convention of IFW members in Malvern, Pennsylvania. They were hoping that about 200 people would show up. They arranged catering for that number of people, and that number of people did not show up.
How many people did show up?
I forget, and I'm not going to look it up.
These are the questions I always manage to stump him with.
But not as many people as they wanted, and they were stuck with a large catering bill. And this nearly tanked the organization. Yeah, it turns out Malvern, Pennsylvania wasn't a great place to do this. Part of the problem was that wargaming really was a primarily Midwestern kind of phenomenon. So that was a long way to travel for everybody. I mean, there were some on the coast too, but unless you happen to be on the East Coast, that was a long way to travel for everybody. They started thinking maybe if we do this again, it should be like in the Midwest, where it's more centrally located. A lot of wargamers are in the Midwest anyway, and then for the people that are on the coast, it's equally annoying to get there. Then Gary Gygax was like, well, I can try to throw this thing together, but only if you have it in my hometown. I'll throw some money at this, but it has to be in my place. So that's why in 1968, they have the very first Gen Con at the Horticultural Hall in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. And it's more successful. Successful enough that they decide to have a second one, Gen Con 2. Very cleverly named there. It's Gen Con 2 that Arneson and his group from the Twin Cities come down, primarily in an attempt to find people that they can play with locally in Minnesota, because this hobby is so spread out and so niche that the best way to find people interested in playing with you in Minnesota is to travel to Wisconsin, because everyone's going to Wisconsin, and somebody from across town that you didn't know existed may also be coming here. But I think also, even though the sources don't say this, the timing lines up right. I think also probably just to line up players for his grand Napoleonic simulation as well, which was going to be play by mail, at least in part. So, they didn't have to be local. Now, I believe at this point, Gygax and Arneson were already familiar with each other. Gygax's group in Lake Geneva does join the Napoleonic campaign. Again, the timelines can be a little fuzzy. I don't know if they joined the campaign after Gen Con or before Gen Con, but they did join. That diplomacy variant that I talked about earlier that adapted it to the Napoleonic era was actually created by one Gary Gygax, which certainly implies that they at least knew of each other. They hadn't met, but they at least knew of each other. This was definitely their first meeting in person and their first opportunity to actually get to know each other. One area of the Grand Napoleonic campaign that hadn't really been very fleshed out yet was naval combat. There wasn't a huge amount of naval combat in the actual Napoleonic Wars. I mean, obviously you had some Mediterranean campaigns, you had Nelson's famous victories at the Nile and at Trafalgar, but you had stuff going on around the world and fictionalized Master and Commander where you had like ships on far-off stations raiding colonies, but it wasn't primarily a naval campaign, but Gygax and his group were enlisted to play the United States in this Grand Napoleonic campaign. The U.S. was tangentially involved in the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, the War of 1812, which we just learned today has at least 91 war games dedicated to it, was essentially an outgrowth of the tensions that were simmering throughout the Napoleonic Wars and the global conflict between France and Britain. Of course, they were going to be far more active participants when you actually have people playing these nations who aren't just going to sit over there and be like, oh, guys, you better stop interdicting our ships, or maybe someday we'll get mad enough to do something about it with the military that we don't really have. You know, they have to actually be actively involved, which meant that there was definitely going to be a lot more naval operation happening. Ethan says, I missed being able to see the Master and Commander boat in San Diego. It was out for repairs. That would have been really cool. By the way, love that movie. Great movie. I would love to see that boat, too. They didn't have naval rules yet. Again, just like all military miniatures campaigns in one way or another link themselves back to H.G. Wells' Little Wars, most naval engagements link themselves back to a set of naval rules created by a guy named Fletcher Pratt in the early 20th century. And again, these rules were for more modern naval warfare. They weren't for warfare way back in the day here. So there weren't any good rules. So Arneson was looking into creating a set of rules, and Gygax is the eternal I want to collaborate with everybody on everything guy. So they decide to, together, do a set of naval rules together that they call Don't Give Up the Ship. This is the first collaboration between these two, and like I said, they're also going to be playing together in this campaign. We got this thing percolating here. The other thing that happens at Gen Con, and this happens at Gen Con 1, not Gen Con 2, I'm a little out of order here, but the other thing that happens at Gen Con for Gary Gygax is he discovers miniatures wargaming for the first time. Because he was really more of a board wargamer. I mean, it's possible he saw something in passing at some point, and certainly since he was reading all the fanzines, he may have read after-action reports that were written by other people, but he was a board wargamer. He was not a miniatures wargamer. At the first Gen Con, there was a demonstration of a game called Siege of Bodenberg. As I said, a lot of military miniature stuff was really underground. The Avalon Hills and the SPIs of the world were not developing rules in this space. Rules were coming from a variety of places, and one source of a lot of these rules would be the owners of hobby shops. The reason for that is these hobby shops would stock miniatures. Then they would either create or commission rule sets that just so happened to use all the miniatures that we sell in our store. Total coincidence that, of course, Jeffrey.
Of course. We don't have a vested interest there.
So this one hobby shop owner had this castle set and created basically a siege scenario around that castle set. Gygax saw that at Gen Con 1 in 1968 and was truly, truly enamored with it. He'd probably heard of it before. Peterson figures he'd heard of it before then. But it's one thing to hear about it, another thing to experience it firsthand. He fell head over heels for miniatures, and he started becoming very interested in the medieval period specifically. Ancient and medieval warfare. So he founded a subgroup within the IFW called the Castle and Crusade Society, dedicated to ancient and medieval wargaming, and started another fanzine, the Domesday Book, in order to kind of promulgate stuff in that space, and once again put out the call for collaborators in this new area. And then he got himself a sand table that he set up in his basement, and he started having his local friends over to play military miniature games in his basement, which led eventually, I think in 1970, to the formation of the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association, which was just Gygax and his friends in his basement. He wasn't a nerd loser in his parents' basement. He was a nerd loser in his own basement. Shocking twist.
Upgrade there.
Indeed. So we have all of these things going on. We have Arneson and Gygax knowing each other now. We have them collaborating on a miniatures rule set. We have this grand Napoleonic campaign that Arneson is running and Gygax is a part of, and David Wesley is a part of, and lots of people are a part of. Then we have Wesley's ongoing quest to introduce different and, in some cases, more realistic elements into the miniature wargaming experience. Now we're going to return to that pillar one more time and return to Wesley. Because at the same time the Grand Napoleonic game is going on, Wesley is continuing to find and think about his own ideas of what makes a compelling and realistic miniatures campaign. He's been writing a set of Napoleonic rules based on Totten, which he's calling Strategos In. It's not published until 1970, but he's definitely actively working on it and probably has it at a pretty decent form by 1969, even though it hasn't been published yet. He's taking things in a different direction. So Arneson is going huge right now. Arneson is taking miniatures wargaming and being like, let's not just simulate one battle. Let's have a huge campaign, and we'll have a diplomacy game on top of military miniatures encounters, and we'll have naval rules and don't give up the ship, and this is all going to be crazy. Then you have Arneson at the exact same time that's focusing in on how can I make the individual encounter more interesting, the individual meeting of two armies more interesting. We know this is happening in 1969. Wesley says it was 67. But remember, these are memories 40 plus years old. At this point, it's over 50, but when he was giving these interviews, it was 40 plus years old. And he didn't have any documents to back it up, but he was insistent that it was happening at the same time that Arneson was running his Napoleonic campaign. And because Arneson started his own newsletter, Corner of the Table, that's what all these guys do. They create fanzines and newsletters. We have the date of the Grand Napoleonic campaign fixed by actual documents, so we know that campaign was in 69. This is why Wesley's work also had to be in 69. On around 1969, he gets into a couple of other books because he's always checking out books from the library and he's always trying to figure out new things to do. And he comes across two books in particular. He comes across one book about game theory. Obviously, that book has a lot of things in it, but one of the main things he takes away from this game theory book is that a game does not need to be zero sum. By which I mean there has to be a winner and a loser. One side, completely dominates. A game does not have to be chess, where the only options are you win, they win, or it's a stalemate, it's a draw. Games do not need to be zero sum. You can have a game where everybody has competing objectives, and it's possible for everyone, or at least more than one person, there may still be losers, but it's possible for more than one person to complete their objective within the scope of the game. The other book that he came across was a book that he thought was about military conflict, because it had conflict in the title, but it was actually about alternative solutions to conflicts, like arbitration and interpersonal conflict resolution. Not two armies are in conflict with each other. This book really got him thinking about the idea of you can have a conflict and you can have a solution to that conflict that does not necessarily involve violence. I mean, that's obvious in day-to-day life, but, I don't think Wesley was resolving every single dispute he had with a friend through violence. That would be a whole different narrative. It got him thinking about the idea that in the context of a game and a game world, you don't necessarily have to have every single participant in the game achieve their aim through violence. You can do a game that simulates some other form of conflict resolution to it as well. Out of these things, combined with his Totten, combined with his referee and anything can be attempted that he's got, he thinks to himself, what if I have a multifaceted game where there are two armies, but there are also other participants in the area, something that they'd kind of used before in the terms of like asking a farmer, where the enemy came from. But instead of these just being like abstract kind of ideas like that, actually have individuals take on other roles besides the army commanders that could also be involved in this scenario. Their objectives don't need to align with the objectives of the armies. They can have their own objectives, These objectives don't necessarily have to be achieved through military conflict, and it could be possible for multiple individuals to complete their objectives within the same game. It doesn't have to be two sides, where just one side wins and just one side loses. And then there was one other element that Wesley brought in. Of all places, just a traditional board game. Not a fancy German, lots of fiddly bit board games or an Avalon Hill war game. Just an ordinary mainstream board game from Parker Brothers called Careers. Because what Careers had that influenced him is it had an unusual system of determining victory. As part of the goal of the game, you had to accumulate victory points. But there were different ways that you could accumulate victory points in the game, and at the start of the game, you secretly determined how many victory points you were going for in each of these, like, three major categories. Then the other players didn't know that that's what your objective was throughout the game, and you only reveal at the end or whatever, I guess. I've never played Careers, but that's my understanding based on how it was described. So from this, he came up with the idea that victory will be determined by victory points, and every player gains victory points in different ways. They all have different objectives. And those objectives are known only to them. I mean, they can reveal them to other people if they want, but I mean, each character is going to have a custom sheet that tells them who they are, what their role in the game is, and what their conditions for victory are, kind of based on this idea of the victory points in Careers. So he comes up with a game that is set in a university town called Braunstein. It's vaguely somewhere in Western Germany, probably around the Rhineland someplace, where Prussia, it's complicated. Germany's complicated in this period. It's not important. It's Holy Roman Empire, which, as Voltaire said, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But the Prussians, even though they're an Eastern power, have a few scattered holdings in the West. So this Braunstein is part of the Prussian holdings in the West. The French are going to invade. So there's going to be a French army moving through, and there's a militia commander commanding the local Landwehr who needs to hold off the French forces until help arrives. So far, this is a very standard wargame scenario. But this town of Braunstein also is a university town. There's a university there, and the university students, being young radicals, have some sympathies towards the French, because this is pre-Napoleon. This is still, the 1790s, the Revolutionary period. So there had recently been a kind of pro-revolution student uprising in town, and some of the students were imprisoned. This is part of the scenario. So the chancellor of the university is also caught in a bind because he wants to make sure that his students are not mistreated by the military. You don't just have characters taking on the leader of the French army, the colonel of the local Landwehr. You also have the chancellor of the university as a character. You have one of the ringleaders of the student agitation as a character. You have another student that's actually sympathetic to the regime and so is pro-Prussian and wants to help the local Landwehr in taking care of all of these revolutionary sympathizers. So you have all of these townsfolk characters that are not leading armies and whose goal is not to achieve victory on the battlefield. They have a set of objectives that Wesley has spelled out for each character. The idea of this game is there's complete fog of war, so nobody knows what's going on, and characters that are performing actions or are interacting with each other will go into a side room in groups of 1 or 2 or 3 and talk to Wesley, and Wesley is serving as the referee. They'll tell him what they're doing. And in the spirit of Totten, anything can be attempted. Then it'll be up to Wesley to decide how successful that is. So what we have here is basically a role-playing game. It's fascinating because the game is actually a failure, and Wesley considers it a failure. They never get to the military action. It is still a military war game, so at some point there was still supposed to be a battle. It turns out people were having so much fun taking on these roles and scheming with each other and talking to each other that they were continuing to role-play and interact with each other outside of Wesley's purview. So, at one point, one of the students and the Landwehr colonel come in together and they're like, "We're fighting a duel now." Wesley's like, wait a minute. You're over here with your troops and you're over here at the university. Like, you're not even the same place. How can you fight a duel with each other? It's like, oh, no. I went to see the colonel and we've been talking and he won't do what I want him to do. And so now we've insulted each other's honor and we're fighting a duel. So Wesley has to come up with rules to do a duel, which is not part of this. And like, they're not even together. And so he feels he's lost control of the game, because it's spiraling out of control without him. I mean, you know how players get, Jeffrey, when they start talking to each other.
Yeah, they get crazy, but the sign of a good GM, I've always thought, is you adapt the game to the situation.
You do.
The rule of fun. Everyone's having fun doing this. Okay, then obviously my scope is too big. Let's scope it down to these people interacting, trying to do their thing, and the war happens regardless of their influence.
Exactly. But there's no such thing as a DM at this time, because we're not fully into a role-playing game yet. In theory, there is still a war game going on where the referee is supposed to be overseeing all part of what's happening and who is supposed to acknowledge and authorize what's going on. Obviously, Wesley is being somewhat reactive. He's got the idea of anyone can attempt anything. But the idea that the players are taking actions in this world outside of the prescribed whatever of going in 1 and 2 at a time and speaking to the referee is not something that he was expecting at all. So he thought the game was a failure. He considered it a dud. But the players loved it. The members of the Twin City Military Miniatures Group loved it. And they were basically like, when can we do this again? They started running these types of games, which they called Braunsteins, because the first one was set in Braunstein. They weren't all set there, but that's the name that they took on, which inhabited this weird middle ground between what was acknowledged to be a war game and a military miniatures game and what would later become an RPG. It's not codified enough yet that you can call what they're doing an RPG as we think of an RPG today. But it was basically de facto the first role-playing game. Not the first time anyone had ever played a game where they took on roles. I'm sure that's happened before. And I mean, the concept of role-playing has been used before. Like, the concept of role-playing existed before this. Not a role-playing game, not an RPG like we think of Dungeons and Dragons, but the idea of role-playing in psychiatry and in think tanks working through problems, that existed. But we've basically gotten to the point where we have something that's kind of akin to a role-playing game. Then in October 1970, they've done a few of these, and then in October 1970, Wesley, who's a reservist, I think, in the military, gets called to duty. So his kind of informal leadership role of the group, particularly in the running of this Braunstein stuff, has to come to an end. Now, he doesn't leave the group, and he still comes back frequently because he's stationed nearby, and he comes back frequently on furlough. He's not just out of the picture, but this informal leadership role he can take on, he's been taking on, is no longer something he can do. So in his place, Dave Arneson becomes kind of the leading figure in running these Braunstein-type games. At the same time, he's getting kind of fed up with his Grand Napoleonic campaign. There's been some dissension. It's gotten huge. I mean, there are like almost 30 people involved. Some people don't like the way he's refereeing it, and another game kind of splits off from his game. There's a splinter, and it's just becoming a headache, and he's becoming sick of it. So he decides that he's going to refocus his efforts on doing a new Braunstein, where they're basically going to take the people from the Napoleonic game, the people that are local, like the close people, not all 26 people that have been part of it, but the close people. Basically, their characters are going to be dropped en masse into a new world. Because remember, in this Napoleonic campaign, there's not a lot of role-playing going on, but they're technically playing the roles of heads of state, and they're not playing the historical heads of state. They're putting some of their own personality into these rulers. And they're basically all going to be dropped into this new world. As he put it, he had been reading a lot of Conan recently and watching a lot of Hammer horror films. As a result of this, according to him, he thought that it would be great to drop them into this kind of spooky, marshy, fantasy kind of a place for this new Braunstein. This becomes, in 1971, when it starts, this becomes something entirely new, a new Braunstein called Blackmore. It just so happens that at the same time that he's starting Blackmore, our newly ancient and medieval obsessed miniatures wargamer Gary Gygax is working on a new set of rules for military miniatures that is going to have just a little bit of a twist in the back.
What's the twist?
Involving, of all things, fantasy. So that's where we'll leave this first episode. So we've got these disparate elements, this board wargaming stuff, this military miniature stuff, these wargaming clubs like the International Federation, the Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Group or Association, the Twin Cities Military Miniatures Group. We have these collaborations happening, these conventions starting, and this new kind of game pioneered by Wesley and being pushed forward by Arneson called the Braunstein, that takes military miniatures to such a personal level that it is essentially what we would today call role-playing. In our second episode, we will take a look at how all of these disparate threads that we've been following and which have been occasionally intersecting are going to come together to create Dungeons and Dragons, Satan's Game.
Really, it astonishes me just how many different aspects all had to coalesce together in order to create this. Just having so much RPG stuff that was coming in where people just fell in love with it. Then you had people taking, miniatures. I want miniatures. I wanted to have these minis going around a dungeon. I need to have combat at a large scale, at a small scale. It's crazy.
We mentioned a dungeon.
Oh, there we go.
2 hours and 22 minutes into the recording. There it is, your mention of a dungeon. Whoever had the pool going on when we'd finally mention one. 2:22.
Put it into your bingo.
Yeah, well, Peterson has said, and I think this is true. I mean, you can quibble about definitions, and no, Ethan, we're not going to define an RPG. We'll leave that to others. But, Peterson has said, and I agree with it, even though you can quibble around the edges, that RPGs, role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, are really the only completely new type of game that emerged in the 20th century, and maybe even for some time before that. There were card games, and there were dice games, and there were board games, and there were war games, and, all of this stuff. Different athletics and sports, and all of this. Tabletop games, electromechanical tabletop games, early coin-op stuff, bagatelle and pinball, and all of this. But the tabletop RPG is like nothing that came before. It birthed something new out of whole cloth that has now become one of the major forms of game, major forms of entertainment that exists today, with the incredible popularity in the past decade that D&D and other RPGs have truly attained. Because it is something entirely new, it has that messy origin because since it was like nothing else before it, like individually speaking, it had to pull a little bit from this, a little bit from that, a little bit from this other place, a little bit from over here. So you have all of these different ideas colliding across these groups of people across the country, surprisingly pretty close to each other, all things considered. Most of them are in the Midwest, but still technically across the entire country, that just takes all of these little elements and turns them into this new thing, which is why we're spending so long on this, which is why the DragonCon version was very abridged. Can you imagine that we did all of this and more in 50 minutes at DragonCon? I can be brief when I have to be.
It is shocking. It is really shocking. And if you're a patron, you can see that thing.
Indeed. It's a good talk, even though this is the more in-depth version. It's good for what it is as well. And it has slides.
A British version.
Indeed. So, yeah, that's definitely the place, I think, to wrap up part one. Part two, we'll talk about the creation of Dungeons & Dragons and the early spread of Dungeons & Dragons. We're not going to do a complete history of D&D and TSR, but kind of walk it through the 70s and into the early 80s, but not getting super nitty-gritty. We're not going to get nitty-gritty into the corporate shenanigans, as much as I love that. Then in the third episode, we'll talk about how that migrates to games, and that gives us a good framework that we can get done in 3. That's right, 3. 1, 2, 5. No, 3, my lord. 3 episodes.
Well, in that case, we will see you next time on They Create Worlds. Unless you're live and on Twitch, then you get to see it in about, 15 minutes.
Indeed.
We'll see you soon. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have linked to some of the things that we discuss in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, The Story of the People and Companies That Shaped the Video Game Industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. You can email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. If you do sign up, please do so through the website and not through the iOS app. This saves you from the 30% Apple markup. We understand that you may not be financially able to support us, but you can still support us by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the podcasting service you use. We now have the podcast available on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.